get it?
I
Got
got
it? Okay, cool. I
it.
think it's recording.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We made it. Thank you and welcome everyone for being here. Before we begin, we'll do a quick introduction of your hosts. So my name is Natalie. We're all with the Student Sustainability Center, and I am Amy's intern for Operations and Resources.
And hi, my name is Samantha. I'm an intern for corporate accountability at the Student Sustainability Organization.
Hi, I'm Amy. I am the Director of Operations and Resources at the Student Sustainability Collective, and I just wanted to start us off by giving an introduction of what's going on today. So first of all, the Student Sustainability Collective, or the SSC for short, is a student-run, non-hierarchical organization on campus. We promote sustainable policy and facilitate social justice dialogue in relation to issues pertaining to public health, energy and waste, and more. Recently, we've been focusing on a campaign surrounding climate change, and for this specific event, we wanted to highlight the political polarization surrounding climate change and sustainability as a whole. We were inspired by the documentary Purple Mountains, which explores America's division on climate-related issues, but acknowledges the fact that environmentalism used to be a bedrock issue for conservatives, such as President Nixon. The film also features one of our wonderful speakers, Jerry Taylor. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming again. Thank you, panelists, for being here. I just wanted to provide a reminder that each question will have about 5 minutes to answer. And yeah, let's just get started with the first question. If you can, yeah, thank you. This question will be for all panelists, and it's not going to be in a specific order. So panelists, whenever you're ready, just go for it. But what is your background in regards to sustainability, climate change, and/or environmental politics? Where do you witness political polarization, whether it be in the workplace, the country, or within urban-rural divides? And how do you think we can foster empathy on both sides?
Well, I guess I'll jump in since there's a deafening quiet. My name is Jerry Taylor. I'm the president and co-founder of the Niskanen Center, which is a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. And my background with regards to climate change is that for 20 odd years, from 1991 to 2014, I worked at the Cato Institute and was responsible for the climate change policies and environmental and energy policy work that we did there. And I was originally brought on to be a force for opposition to climate action. I was a skeptic about the case for decarbonization. And so I was a gunslinger on the dark side, as it were. But over the course of 20 odd years of that work, my mind slowly changed. It didn't happen all at once, and there was no one particular event, but the accumulation of evidence that climate change is real, that it poses significant risk to the future, that it is imposing significant costs on the present, and that it is an extremely disruptive event, not only for the ecosystems of the world, but for the global economy and the well-being of mankind as a whole. And for those reasons, over the course of 20 odd years, I found it increasingly difficult to hold my old case against climate action. So I changed my mind. Not very many people change their minds, especially when they're paid to hold position X, and abandoning position X means your paycheck is in doubt, if not liquidated. Which is one of the reasons why I started the Niskanen Center. We had to find a place on the center right where people could talk reasonably about climate change, and there wasn't any such place in Washington at the time. So where do I witness political polarization in this country? Well, for the most part, our issue is the Republican Party. If you look at public opinion surveys, you find the overwhelming majority of Americans believe that climate change is real. The federal government needs to do something significant about it. And the opposition to that comes from the more partisan members of the GOP. And that's where we see our problem. How can we foster empathy? Well, the reality is that people believe, Winston Churchill once said, there's no such thing as public opinion, there's only published opinion. And if you look in the political science literature, whether you're looking at Philip Converse or John Zoller, people who've done work on, where public opinion comes from and what informs it, the overwhelming majority of the evidence is that people believe the things they believe because they're trusted journalists, public intellectuals, political figures, and tribal leaders. And I don't mean that as pejorative, but we do live in a world of political tribalism. Argue X, and X becomes their position. So if we want to change Republican minds about climate change, we have to change the minds of the people who are writing in opposition to action, who are arguing in opposition to action, either within the ranks of the United States Congress and the Senate, or the presidential candidates the Republicans trot out, the people at Fox News, the people at National Review, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and places like that. In other words, what we need to do, in my opinion, is change how Republican elites and conservative elites are dealing with climate change. When you think about it, there's really nothing conservative about playing dice with the planet, playing dice with the future of your children. Usually people who go play dice and bet it all on black on the roulette wheel in Las Vegas aren't thought of as conservative. And there's no obvious reason why working class white voters, which are ostensibly the base of the Republican Party these days, should be throwing their bodies in front of the profit lines of ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and companies like that, and the Coke Industries. So there's nothing exactly there's nothing structural to this problem. The problem is that climate denialism and hostility to climate action has become a core identity feature of conservatives, because what they have been fed for 20, 30 odd, 40 years, and I help feed it, so I know of which I speak, is the argument that people who want to do something about climate change are also people who hate industrial capitalism, people who don't like profits, people who are democratic socialists, people who have long had an axe to grind against fossil fuels, because fossil fuels is the bloodstream of modern industrial society, and environmentalists want to put a stop to that. And the climate change is the latest rationale for why we ought to do that. That sort of narrative has been injected into the bloodstream of Republicans for a very long time. And I wish there were easy answers about how to detoxify the GOP on this front. There aren't any easy answers. It means it's a long haul, but it's the only way through. And even if the challenge is great, we have no choice but to undertake it.
The first thing I'm going to do when I get off this call is watch that documentary. What an incredibly fascinating story, Jerry. Thank you. It is really amazing to meet somebody who, changed their mind about this very polarizing of issues. So my background is a little bit opposite. I mean, I feel like we may meet somewhere, but I was a youthful environmental activist. I dropped out of Oxford University when I was 19 years old to go and join the kind of extreme sort of eco-communards that I had come across, and that I thought were going to, they seemed kind of pure and fierce enough to avert an environmental catastrophe. And so I spent about 10 years on the kind of extreme left of this sort of action. And then I dropped back in and got myself a career. And so, became the pillar of society that you see before you right now. But in 2018, I really, the scale of the environmental crisis really brought me back into activism. And it's been very interesting to be back in the trenches as a sort of middle-aged, middle-class person. And I have certainly changed my mind about a lot of the things about the nature of capitalism, what exactly is the nature of the environmental problem and how it's bound up with these questions of political economy. as for where I see political polarization, I'm interested in the density divide. So why it is that the rural-urban divide seems to be such a point of polarization, both where I come from in the UK and Europe and where I am here. And fostering empathy, I think this kind of thing is great for that. But I'm also a great believer in local action and local politics as a site of overcoming bipartisanship. So yeah, that I think because people care about local issues in a completely different way that tends to be less ideological.
Sure, I'll jump in next. I'm Mark Jacobson. I'm a professor of economics here at UCSD. I've spent most of my career studying automobile regulation, which is in some ways in the center of some of the polarizing issues because automobiles and the usage of them are distributed fairly unevenly in the US. Certainly the rural-urban divide is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've worked on regulation and environmental problems all of my career really, and even actually before graduate school, I did some work on these integrated assessment models of climate change. That was actually sort of the closest I was to climate, but that was many years ago. And now I'm more studying energy regulation, but of course, energy regulation is climate regulation in many ways, and gets at um, a lot of the issues. I think that the politics of it is fascinating. I was at a conference yesterday where Heather Bushi was speaking, the Council of Economic Advisors, talking about Biden's climate plan and really making some pretty strong statements against carbon taxes and economic incentives in favor of things that she felt would help bridge some of this political divide. And I don't know if they will or not, but it's it's possible that with the right sort of pieces of regulation and mandates, you can sort of pay off the right people and build a coalition. Year or two ago, it seemed like the politics was moving more toward a carbon tax or nothing, of course, but that if the federal government were to do something about climate change, it would be an economic incentive as opposed to a technology mandate. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time thinking about these things. How can we foster empathy and where is the worst polarization? Well, as I mentioned, I think Jerry's comments were spot on in terms of identity politics and so on, that we're in a situation where um, uh, our computers and so on feed us the pieces of news that we want to see, and they know exactly what we want to see, and that's all we see. And so getting that sort of stream from the top changed in terms of what people are saying is important. I don't know how to do that, but that made a lot of sense. Fostering empathy um, is tough in many ways, I think, especially with the rural-urban divide, right? And it's very hard to think about, um, in the city, what we're going to have a trolley to UCSD after a few more years of messing around with construction and whatever, right? And we'll have options for our transportation, and in rural areas, there just aren't. And the way energy is used in different parts of the country and so on are so massively different that I think we need to really try and put ourselves in the shoes of energy users in other places and think about, what's my energy bill like? What's the energy bill like of somebody in Minnesota or Texas, and what are they spending their money and their sort of carbon footprint on, and how does that differ? So.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for these already so thoughtful responses to the introduction. We will move on now to the individual questions. So we'll start with Professor Kathy Geary. First question, how have both political parties contributed to political polarization surrounding climate change?
Thanks, Natalie. I think I forgot to mention I'm a historian of science here at UCSD, so sorry for just plunging into my youthful autobiography. Yeah, how have both political parties? Well, I think Jerry covered the Republican Party really well. I do have a rather maybe a simplifying formulation for what the problem is on both sides, as I see it. And it's really on the extremes of the political parties. But I think that at both edges, neither side is willing to admit that the choices are hard. And so the choices about the environmental predicament that we find ourselves in. And so leftists insist against all the demographic evidence that consumer capitalism is horrible for humans as well as the non-human world. And so, you know, if we just somehow get rid of capitalism, you know, it's kind of fairly straightforward. We just have to sort of shuck off our false consciousness and, you know, enter into some kind of better, more utopian state of some kind of cooperation. And so the two things will kind of solve themselves together. All the ills of humanity and all the ills of the environment will be solved together by this move. So no hard choices to be made. We're just going to, you know, solve it all together in this kind of utopian register. And then at the right wing of the Republican Party, they just insist there's no problem with the environment, that capitalism doesn't cause problems with the environment, or at least no problems. So first of all, just denial, as Jerry pointed out, that climate change isn't real, that biodiversity loss isn't a problem, that plastic pollution isn't a problem, that ocean acidification isn't a problem. So just denial of the basic scientific facts of environmental degradation is one strategy. Or a little bit in from that real kind of nutter strategy is that there's nothing that free markets can't solve. And so, you know, we can still rely on the basic workings of, you know, unfettered supply and demand to get us all the goods that we treasure, including that of environmental sustainability. And so again, no hard choices. We don't have to make any hard choices. So I think that that's one way that the extremes of the political parties have contributed to an impossibility of actually having a dialogue about these issues that that tackles the thorny questions about taxation and incentives and, you know, what we might have to give up and how we might have to change the choice architecture of our cities and, you know, these sorts of things. Yeah, so that would be a sort of formulation about the extremes. And yeah, I completely agree that information is at the basis of all of this, and that we listen to those that we trust, and that some kind of way of achieving a more sort of intersubjective reality based on logic and the facts is really incredibly important and really tough problem to solve. How to get the information stream more consensual.
Yeah, so our next question kind of ties in nicely with your emphasis on how the extremes can be very polarizing. It's what divisions do you see that contribute to this issue of political polarization? A few examples, and if you see any potential solutions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll go back to this urban-rural divide. It's been extraordinary. You know, I come from the UK, and of course, Brexit was the huge upheaval that rather was a harbinger of the Trump administration and the kinds of polarization that we've seen in this country over the last 4 or 5 years. And that was very much an urban-rural divide. I mean, not in any kind of neat way, but the big cities tended to want to remain in the European Union, and the suburbs and rural areas tended to want to go the other way, make the break. And I've seen this happen even in California, that what used to be a north-south divide has become more of a west-east divide. And so you have the coastal cities leaning one way, leaning further and further one way, and the inland rural areas leaning further and further the other way. And so I think of District 2 in San Diego County, you know, this vast area of mostly unincorporated land, agriculture, reservations, national parks, mining, manufacturing, this sort of thing. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with Mark that we really need to think about the infrastructural differences between these two conditions of existence, that it's really, really different to live in a city center and to think about transportation than it is to live you know, out in some unincorporated kind of hinterland or out in the desert or something like that. And I think that that movement in France, the Gilets jaunes movement, which started out, it was this kind of big sort of resistance movement against gas taxes. And so all these people who were united in a absolute kind of hostility to the government, and were really extremely militant about it. I had a friend who was stopped by the Gilets jaunes on a road, a country road, and you know, everyone, they demanded, they made the car, they had you know, a car stop where they made everyone stop and show their papers and explain what they were doing and things like this. I mean, it sounded actually quite alarming. Extremely militant movement. And it was a working class movement against gas taxes. And I think as the cities have become more and more, sort of inner cities have become more expensive and more prosperous and more kind of tied up with global finance, ordinary workers have been moved out to the suburbs and the rural areas and remote villages and things like that, that these questions about transportation infrastructure and energy infrastructure have become genuinely divisive with good reason. And that as urbanites, we should pay attention to our supply chains and our energy infrastructures and not dismiss anyone who's facing a different kind of different conditions of existence than we are.
Great, thank you. And our final question for you is inspired by your book, The Drama of the Commons. So this is, how could eco-socialism play a role in advocating for sustainability, human rights, and other aspects? How does this compare to capitalism? And then again, yes, feel free to incorporate any of your ideas that are discussed in The Drama of the Commons.
When I read this question, I wondered if I was here under false pretenses because I'm deeply against eco-socialism, just in case. So, you know, I don't represent the left in that respect. I think one of the great divisive problems with the left is its refusal to accept anything about the historical record of socialism, which has been dismal. You know, most socialist states have been not just environmental disasters, but also humanitarian catastrophes. So I don't in any way advocate for a socialist state. I think socialist movements are somewhat different kettle of fish, but yeah, it was actually out of extreme dissatisfaction with the kind of utopian rhetoric of the far left that I started writing this book, which is actually called The Urban Commons. And so it explores a really different political philosophy developed by a group at Indiana University who studied hundreds of examples of what they call traditional commons, which are resources such as forests and fisheries and watersheds that are owned and managed by all who use them, rather than being kind of individually owned as private property or owned by the state as public property. And so there's a couple of things that I particularly value about this research, that it takes questions of sustainability as problems in their own right. So, you know, I think the eco-socialists tend to take it just as given that capitalism is a problem, and that overcoming it or overthrowing it or something like that is the main goal, and that environmentalism will just sort of come along, sustainability will come along as a fringe benefit for that. But the Indiana school, the Bloomington school, as they are known, these people who study traditional commons take sustainability as their kind of central problem, and they're agnostic as to which kind of property regime will best serve that. In some cases, it's private property, capitalism, profit motive, all of that stuff. In other cases, it's public property, nationalization of resources might provide the answer. And the cases that they are particularly interested in are these much less well understood cases of commons, where people, manage their own, manage natural resources as communities, kind of from the bottom up. And so the other thing that I really like about this work is that it's firmly based in the psychology of neoclassical economics. So it accepts, or it kind of takes as a fundamental assumption, that humans are self-interested beings, and that collective action problems should be modeled on that assumption. So the problem of how do you actually act collectively should be modeled on that assumption. And that the question is really, how can we, and this is the question for the environmental predicament, I think, very much, is how can we as self-interested beings work together to overcome the problem of our fairly rampant degradation of the living systems on which our lives depend.
Wow, that was really incredible. Thank you so much for all of that input. That was very greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for that response. And now moving on to some questions that we have for Jerry Taylor. The first question that we have for you is, what did the process of becoming an environmental advocate look like for you?
It's pretty freaky. I found myself increasingly making common cause, breaking bread, and becoming friends with the people that I had been in battle with for many years. So, for instance, in the early 2000s, I remember I was on a TV show, maybe it was CNN or CNBC, I forget, and I was debating Joe Romm, who's a climate scientist and an outspoken advocate for climate action who had served in various Democratic administrations. At the time, he was soon become a major actor at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., which is probably the foremost center-left think tank in the country. And Joe and I were debating climate change on the air. It was one of those things that actually was one of those key events in changing my mind. I had argued on the show that, it's been more than 10 years since James Hansen testified in front of the United States Senate. He argued that if we continued on a business as usual path, we'd see warming in the future. And he actually had a model which gave us projections about the warming we'd expect to see. And I said, Joe, it's been more than 10 years. We've had business as usual. There's been no meaningful mitigation adopted at the federal or state level. And yet we've only seen about a third of the warming that James Hansen says we should have seen by now. Well, that tells me that not that climate change isn't real, but it tells me the models are running hot and the atmosphere is not as sensitive to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions as we thought. And that means that we should think twice about radical undertakings to decarbonize the economy and transform the entire global system. So I was pretty good on TV, so I had a good chance to debate people like him and John Pasquantano, who was the head of Greenpeace USA, who's become since a very good friend of mine. But we went into the green room after the show, and Joe said, "Did you even read James Hansen's testimony that you just mutilated on the air?" And I said, "Well, a long time ago. It's been more than a decade, but this is based on Senate testimony that one of my colleagues had recently given, so I'm pretty up to speed with it. Why? And he said, let me explain to you why what you argued was a complete load of nonsense, but I didn't have the time to deal with it on the air because, we only have about 5 minutes and I can't get into much detail. He says, strictly speaking, you are correct. His scenario A, which was his business as usual scenario, ran projections that produced higher temperatures than what we've seen. But what you didn't mention is the main reason for scenario A being off in retrospect is the greatly overestimated greenhouse gas emissions. He did not anticipate recessions. He did not anticipate the emergence of natural gas in the power sector. He did not anticipate Mount Pinatubo. He did not anticipate changes in natural forcings. He said, so the point is, he expected more warming than we've received because he expected more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere under that business as usual scenario. He says, so it wasn't that the models ran hot. It's just that, predicting future emissions is awful tough. He said, but if you go down in his testimony, you'll see that he offered a scenario B and actually a scenario C as well. But scenario B offered another set of projections, assuming US undertakings to reduce greenhouse gases. And those projections of future greenhouse gas emissions were, natural and anthropogenic, were pretty much what we've seen in aggregate. And he ran his computer models for that scenario as well. And Jerry, those computer modeling exercises are nearly spot on as far as predicting what we have actually seen in retrospect. He said, so when you come on the air and say, oh, the models run hot, and, James Hansen is a charlatan, and the atmosphere isn't as sensitive to greenhouse gases, that's just nuts. He says, because the scenario he ran, which for various reasons ended up having more or less the profile of forcing agents in the atmosphere, was pretty accurate with regards to the temperature increases we've seen. He says, now notice it just took me 5 minutes to explain that to you. I wouldn't have the time to do that on the air. Plus it gets into a level of sophistication that's going to be beyond anybody watching on television. He said, which is why I hate debating hacks like you, and I'm not going to do it anymore. He says, because all I'm doing is giving you a platform for misinformation. He said, now, if you don't believe me, and you don't want to be a hack for the rest of your life, even though I suspect you're probably pretty comfortable with being a hack for the rest of your life, he said, but if you're not comfortable being that guy, then go back to your office, look over Hansen's testimony again, and you tell me if I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, let's hash it out privately. Well, that was a hell of a challenge, right? So I go back to my office and I actually looked at the testimony. Because I wasn't going to let, this, I had pride in my work. I was acting in good faith, and I thought that I actually had done my homework reasonably well. But it turns out that Joe was right. And why was I so off? Well, the reality is look, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I'm not, it's not my field. I'm a good arguer. Right, and I like to think I'm a pretty good policy analyst who does homework, but it's not my field. So I defer to people whose field it is, like my colleague at the time, Pat Michaels, who is a climate scientist, who is one of the foremost climate skeptics in the United States. He's credentialed. He's got a PhD. He's taught at university. He's actually published in a few peer-reviewed journals. He's not a make-believe scientist. He's a real one. And it was his testimony that I was running off of that he gave him from the United States Senate, which offered that argument. So I walked down down the hallway, and Pat was in, and I knocked on his door and said, "Hey, I just got back from CNN or whatever network it was, I forget." Told him about the debate. Told him about Rahm's counter argument in the green room. Told him about my experience looking back at the testimony just now, and I said, "Pat, I must be off somewhere here because it looks like Joe's absolutely right. So where am I wrong? What am I missing in this? Assuming still that there's more to this story. There wasn't more to this story. Pat Michaels knew exactly what he was doing when he was offering misleading testimony about James Hansen in his 1988 testimony. He could not possibly have not known. It was clear as day. But it's not like Pat. I know Pat pretty well. It's not like he is a totally bad faith actor. Pat believes in his bones that climate change is an overwrought problem, but Pat will cut corners and cheat to score a debating point, right? In this particular case, mischaracterizing the position of his opponents. So, that rattled me a lot. So when you ask, like, what did the process of becoming an environmental advocate look like to me? What it looked like to me was a terrible realization that I had never been doing the due diligence that I really should have, that I would put the arguments of the other side under a microscope, that I would not place the arguments that I was forwarding, and I was trusting people that I should not be trusting. And once that event had played out, I became a lot more careful. And what I found was that climate skeptics were offering variations of the story I just told you over and over and over and over again, not always in the same fashion. Sometimes they'd cite studies that were rejected by peer-reviewed journals as if they were meaningful things. Sometimes there was cherry-picked data. Sometimes there were misrepresent, uh, good faith, but still incompetent misrepresentations of the literature. And I found that I could no longer trust people making the case against it, at least on the scientific grounds. So I found myself all of a sudden, embracing arguments from people in the other tribe, people who are the center left or progressive left of American politics. But I found that a lot of the cases, they're not really all that liberal. They just work in organizations that, have that demeanor. So if you know Joe Rahm, Joe's not really like, super Naomi Klein, this changes everything anti-capitalist leftist. He's not. Neither is Jonathan Chait. Neither are a lot of the people I've met in the climate movement. They're all pretty reasonable. John Pasquantano, the head of Greenpeace USA, turns out is a real moderate on just about every other issue, save for this one. But in my old world, we looked at every single person who was carrying the torch for climate action as someone who hated industrial capitalism, who hated economic growth, who hated obsessions with GDP, who offered emotional paeans to pastoralism and old societies where sustainability and living within means would essentially put us in a fantasy version of Amish Pennsylvania. And that was the sort of red meat that I just went to town on when I was arguing to the right that in entertaining climate action is a dangerous ideological thing, because you could not have industrial capitalism with decarbonization. And I didn't have to work hard to make that argument. All I had to do was buy Naomi Klein's book and boom, I've got my Bible. Or all I had to do was cherry pick Al Gore's book, Earth and Balance, and find a chapter or two where Al Gore got a little bit wobbly on why we shouldn't work, metric our well-being by how much we make and how much we consume, and that there's spirit. Those things are all true, but they sound to a Fox News viewer like Al Gore is, some sort of hippie in flowing robes selling pencils at the airport. It's easy to misrepresent him because, I know Al Gore now, and I know he doesn't believe anything like that, but he walks right into it. So to sum it up, the process of becoming an environmental advocate, at least in the climate space, was the process of awakening a bit to the reality of the nature of the debate around me, and coming to terms with the fact that just because somebody might not, that a lot of the things I thought that my opponents believed in, they really didn't. And even when they do, what difference does it make? We can disagree about, regulatory policy or social policy, but it has absolutely nothing to do with atmospheric physics. Atmospheric physics is not an ideological matter. It's not a part of it. It just is. It's not really subject to debate. If there are scientific facts, and if you're a conservative, it doesn't matter that the people who are embracing action based on these atmospheric physics have a leftist agenda. What are you going to do? Deny them? How is capitalism going to, and the industrial world going to look like 70 years from now when the whole planet is burning down and GDP is collapsing because of climate change? It's not going to be any. It's not going to be any great benefit to Charles Koch or his heirs.
Thank you again for such a detailed answer and story. We really appreciate it. That was great to hear. Very interesting. So moving on to the next question, we have, from your experience, why has there been a recent surge in political polarization over environmentalism, probably within the last more like couple of decades?
Well, it goes arm in arm with the surge in political polarization across the board. Everything is becoming more polarized today, not just climate change and environmentalism, but absolutely everything. So climate change is being dragged in its wake. But again, the special point I'd want to make is that when I began my tour of duty on the Death Star back when I was at the Cato Institute, arguing against climate action, the main strategy we had, at least the people in my movement, not necessarily my strategy, but their strategy was not to debate the other side. They weren't in the business of winning debates with, climate scientists. They weren't in the business of trying to convince people who are leaning for climate action and try to talk them into leaning against climate action. That wasn't their game. Their audience was right-wing Republicans who were wobbling, like Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, for many years, was a modest proponent of climate action, and in fact endorsed cap and trade legislation at one point with Nancy Pelosi in a famous TV ad that they cut. So, I mean, the reality is in 1991, when I began this business, a lot of people on the right were quite open to climate action. And it was not such an absolute, assumption that if you're a conservative, that you've got your head in the sand on this. Remember, in 1991, Margaret Thatcher was probably as outspoken about the need for climate action as was Al Gore. So our job was to change that and to talk to the right about why embracing decarbonization would be the end of industrial capitalism, which would be a dangerous assault on economic liberty and human well-being and economic freedom, and thus individual freedom. And we succeeded, or at least my old world succeeded in that. Now, that wasn't what I wanted to do in this life. I wanted to go out there and convince people like John Pasquitando at Greenpeace that he was wrong to be investing as much as he was investing in climate change. I actually wanted to change minds. I was one of the reasons why I changed my mind about climate action, and most of the people I worked with didn't, is because I actually had to wrestle with the best arguments of this side. I didn't have the luxury of just mouthing off on, a talk radio show about how everybody who cares about climate change is a big Marxist. I had to actually debate people like Karl Pope, who ran the Sierra Club, which means I had to do my homework. I didn't know what he was going to argue up there. I needed to know how to counter it, which means I had to confront the evidence of the side. Most of my colleagues didn't care about the evidence on the other side. They thought they knew they were right. They thought they already had all the answers from their libertarian decoder ring. They thought they could judge this debate based on the underlying motivations of their opponents, and they could glide. So I guess the point I wanted to make is that the denial world that I used to traffic with was very successful at over time convincing people on the right that to embrace climate change as a thing that was actually quite real and that it was important to deal with is as apostate as embracing abortion rights, gun control, high taxes, or anything like that. They succeeded. They've made it a core part of right-wing identity. And they didn't need to convince everybody. They just need to convince that group, because we do know that Republicans are the hard right is a majority of the Republican Party. And because this is a minoritarian government, or at least a sense that political minorities have tremendous blocking power, if they could gin up right-wing opposition to climate action, they can win, even if they don't win the battle for public opinion. And that has a lot to do with why, if there has been more polarization over environmental policy than there has been over other policy arenas, and I'm not really sure that's the case, but to the extent to which that might be the case, well, that's the reason why.
Thank you so much again. Very, very eye-opening information. And so moving on to our final question for the individual questions that we have for you. Now, how do you discuss environmentalism with conservatives?
Well, first of all, one of the advantages I have is that I used to be on their side. So I can say, look, I understand why you're skeptical about climate action. I understand that it's not a matter of acting in bad faith. And it wasn't. When I was this climate skeptic, I was acting in good faith, and I wasn't stupid. It's not like their IQs just happened to be low, or that they've been paid off by Charles Koch to take the. So I mean, and a lot of that vibe you hear from the left when it comes to these conversations. So I can quite honestly say, look, for more than 20 years, not only did I agree with you, I argued your position for a living and wrote pretty much all your talking points that you're offering me right now. So I understand, where you're coming from. But I changed my mind. Let me tell you why. That usually starts from a better place than, say, a lot of ways you might be able to address these conversations. So first, having empathy and being in their shoes, and that's just not not an assertion. You can go back and Google me and see me saying all kinds of silly things on YouTube about climate change. So I mean, there's some credibility to that. And secondly, because I'm an expatriate from the libertarian world, I understand their morals and values and what they care about. They care about individual liberty, autonomy, and freedom. Talking to conservatives about collective well-being and their children's children. I mean, you saw how much conservatives really cared about other people during the pandemic. So I mean, I don't mean to be dark about this, but individual liberty and autonomy is such a powerful gravitational consideration in the right-wing mind, at least in the United States, that any conversation that gets orthogonal of that is just going to lose them. So you need to talk about why it's in their interest to care about climate change. We know that there's really good arguments we can make about future generations. There's very good arguments we can make about the moral calculus involved in condemning people in the third world to far greater damages that we're going to face in the United States because of climate change. But we also know that climate change is imposing very real costs right now, that it's harming the economy right now, that it is harming investors right now, and that the major captains of global capitalism are almost turning white with fear about what climate change means for the future, and it's affecting the decisions of trillions of dollars of capital flows right now. So in other words, you don't need to listen to Greenpeace and Sierra Club and NRDC if you want to hear climate alarmism. You need to listen to BlackRock, and you need to listen to Goldman Sachs. You need to listen to captains of industry who have no particular reason to shade you with a bunch of pseudo-Marxist silliness. I mean, do you believe in capitalism or not? Because the people who've got skin in the game, money and investment in the economy, they're the ones who are making decisions as if climate change is way more serious than you are. And if they're wrong, they're going to lose a lot of money. If you're wrong, you're not going to lose anything. They have a lot more reason to do the due diligence here. So these are kind of conversations that you can have with conservatives that it's hard for or it doesn't really occur to other people to have them. And then the final point is, that I find very persuasive, is the final argument that ended the debate within my own mind about climate action. It was an argument made by a fellow named Bob Litterman, who was a partner at Goldman Sachs. He was a contributor to the Cato Institute at the time. And he's famous as being one of the top risk management professionals in the world, not only in academia, but in practice. He's a pretty wealthy guy. He was responsible for all the risk management practices at Goldman Sachs, which means he had a lot of responsibility. So he came in to see me, and he believes in climate action, however, and he came in to see me because he was pretty, dissatisfied with where Cato was in the debate. And he said, "Look, Jerry, you guys get in these white hot debates about how serious climate change is likely to be somewhere down the road. You believe it'll be at the very low end of the distribution of possible outcomes offered by the IPCC. Your opponents argue that it'll be on the high side of the distribution of possible outcomes as offered by the IPCC. We know there's a big distribution of possible outcomes. The difference between 1.5C and 4.5C for a background doubling of greenhouse gas concentrations is a pretty big spread. And you bring all your scientific firepower to say who's likely to be correct. So that's the wrong way to look at it. So put aside whether your scientists are right that it'll be a lower impact phenomena than is being made out to be the case. Put it aside, because I don't know. I'm not a scientist. He said, but I know at Goldman Sachs, and we're dealing with risks like this all the time, that's not how we referee the discussion. We have to realize that the future is uncertain. There's a wide distribution of possible outcomes, and your job is not to identify the most likely outcome of the 8, 9, 10, 12 you might be able to identify. It's to identify the 8, 9, 10, 12, and then to weight the risks involved, the costs and benefits with all of them, and then to hedge against those risks at the outliers where you can. He said, but in climate change, there's no hedging against this risk. There's no investment we're going to make as a society that's going to pay off if we get climate change. It's not going to happen that way. We only have one planet, one experiment, and one global economy. So if you looked at a non-diversifiable risk, which happened, all over, and he says, I used to deal with those at Goldman Sachs all the time. When you're dealing with a non-diversifiable risk where the outlier scenarios pretty much cause economic collapse within the next century, if not a little bit sooner, or at least enough of an economic collapse that it's going to have the same impact as something like the Great Depression, which there's a lot of very credible economic arguments out there that suggest that is exactly the case for the higher end scenarios. Then you have to, and if you can't hedge against them, then you have to de-invest in the risk. And he said, this is just, simple. And in fact, right after 9/11, it's not like conservatives don't understand this, because they understand in other contexts. Right after 9/11, then Vice President Dick Cheney was on Meet the Press. And he was asked about the prospect that nuclear weaponry that was in the hands of the Pakistani military could find their way to Al Qaeda, which was at the time a really big concern in American foreign policy. There was a mini panic that lasted for about 6 months to a year on that topic. And Dick Cheney said, look, even if there's only a 1% chance that nuclear weaponry out of the Pakistani military could find their way to Al Qaeda, we have to act as if it is a near certainty as far as US public policy is concerned, because the consequences of that 1% playing out are catastrophic, and we cannot take the risk. Yeah, I'm not defending that particular argument in that particular case, but the underlying insight that even small probability scenarios that have catastrophic, super high end costs are things that we have to accept, we have to account for and hedge against. Well, that's the same argument I just made. Conservatives are fine making it in foreign policy, but when it comes to climate change, it's as if the synopses don't fire in their heads.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm just taking it all in. But I think I speak for all of us when I say that I really value your perspective. It's so unique to be able to hear from someone who used to be a climate change skeptic and is now advocating for it. So thank you for everything you shared. Next, we will be transitioning to Mark Jacobson's questions. Our first one is, what are some misconceptions surrounding environmental regulations when it comes to the economy, and how does this actually affect the local economy and business?
Thanks. Yeah, so there's this is a broad topic, but I think that there are misconceptions on both the sort of left and right to do with some of these things. At least um, studying stuff like transportation fuels, which is on the left, one of the misconceptions might be that there's sort of win-win, major win-win possibilities. I think Kathy touched on this a little bit with eco-socialism and the idea that we can sort of fix a whole bunch of things at once, and that if we were to just build electric cars, everybody would be employed, and lots of things would be better, and we'd save the environment too, right? And I think that it probably is costly to do a lot of the energy transitions that are needed. And it's just the same misconception in reverse on the other side, which is that it's we in the US at least, we don't spend a huge amount of our income on energy. And so to the extent that you do make things a little bit more expensive, make it a little bit more expensive to buy a car, whatever it might be, it's really not the end of the world, right? And the misconception, I think, from the right is that if we make cars a little bit more expensive, our way of life will collapse, right? But there's, in the moment in the US, there's sort of 10% more cars than there are driving licenses. And you just don't need more cars than you have driving licenses because, for the obvious reason, right? And so, if you make cars a little bit more expensive and people can't buy quite as many, this is not likely to cause huge economic damage either, right? And so I think that I think those are some important misconceptions. I don't, sort of the Green New Deal stuff and all these things. Our economists often get a little concerned about some of that because it's not clear that that we even need that huge of a transition, that you can decarbonize pretty fast and pretty well just by sort of some incremental changes and raising costs a little bit here and there. How do regulations affect local economies and businesses? I think that's the important one that economists are wrestling with most right now, which is that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity and impact. So that you could have some of the regulations really could be pretty bad for one individual or one business or whatever, and pretty good for another one. And trying to think about or a locality, right? So, um, putting a lot of solar on rooftops in San Diego hasn't really cost us that much money because our electricity is so expensive anyway, and the sun shines pretty well. But if you put that mandate somewhere else, you might end up having a lot higher costs, right? And so there's a lot to do with geography, and distribution across income groups, racial groups, the sort of environmental justice concerns of it's sort of very real that regulation doesn't just affect everyone the same amount by a little bit, right? It affects some people almost not at all, and some people a lot, and dealing with that is um, the thing we haven't really solved, right? And part of me says, well, yeah, with all regulation, everything affects people really unequally, right? I mean, you think about if people paying into the public schools, and some people have a lot of kids, and some people don't have any kids, and some people have proposition whatever it was in California that means their property tax is almost nothing, even though their house is really valuable, and other people have the opposite problem, right? So there's lots of regulations and ways that we do taxation have these incredibly unequal distributional consequences, and I think that environmental rules, I think they also do, but I'm not sure that they're that much worse, right? And so a lot of attention gets paid to how unequal environmental and energy regulation, how unequally it lands. But I think that a lot of regulation lands unequally, and maybe it sort of balances out. But that's from my perspective. These are unanswered questions. So.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult topic, but thank you so much for your insight so far. For our next question, though carbon taxes are highly favorable to economists, how would we go about the political polarization surrounding taxes?
Yeah, so so this is sort of what I mentioned earlier in this conversation yesterday at the conference about what the Biden administration wants to do. And it sounds like there's sort of a major pivot away from anything that sounds like a tax, quite likely to do with the current state of political polarization and the fact that taxes just are such a non-starter. The discussion that we had that I thought was the most interesting part of that was, well, okay, so maybe the federal government's not going to do a tax or a carbon price, and they're going to do regulation. They're going to make people buy electric cars, and they're going to close down fossil fuel power plants and this kind of thing by mandate, by sort of by fiat. The question was, well, okay, fine, but what about all the prices that are starting to exist and getting higher in the U.S., right? So California's cap and trade system, the trading system in the Northeast, a few scattered carbon taxes here and there. What are we supposed to do with the fact that there's these kind of local carbon prices, or even sort of bigger than local, or state or multi-state initiatives emerging, and then also kind of getting this mandate from above that we're just going to be required to do certain things but not pay taxes, right? That if we can find a way to keep burning fossil fuel, we can buy the fuel cheaply. It's just that it's going to be hard to get a gasoline powered car or something, right? That's kind of the goal from the top. While in some states, California and the Northeast, gas is going to be expensive because our carbon prices are going to keep going up and so on. So I think that this is an impossible question in my view, but I don't think we have the answer to this one yet, but we need to keep thinking about it. And I do think that one of the core challenges with it is really not only like how do we arrive at a carbon price, or do we decide to do a carbon price or something else, but the challenge is that even within this one country, we're going to have a mixture of some people paying prices and other people not, and sort of subject to these sort of technical mandates. How to kind of integrate that or have that be fair in any way across states and jurisdictions, I think is something we need to have a conversation about. I from most of my career now, even I suppose, I advocate carbon taxes and prices. I'm an economist. We have it sort of drilled into us. We almost can't suggest anything else. But I think that that's just because we want to find the cheapest way to do stuff, and we have this sort of core belief that let the markets work and have these incentives, and that will sort of find the cheapest abatement. Um, and I think economists need to kind of come around and say, well, it would be nice to have this done cheaply, but if we can't have it done cheaply because of the politics, because of the polarization, maybe it's not possible to get really cheap. I mean, it is possible, right? And that's why it's so frustrating, right? But maybe we're not going to have it cheap. Maybe we have to do expensive stuff, right? They're just sort of mandating particular technologies and whatever. And yeah, it'll cost us more, but maybe that's the price we pay because of the polarization. And we need to be thinking more about how to make those policies, conditional on them not being the cheapest. How do we make them at least somewhat cost effective and more sort of um, equitable?
Thank you for trying to answer that question. I know it's going to be like a lifelong battle to figure this out, but I do appreciate your input. And I remember learning about carbon taxes back in Econ 131, environmental economics. So it's interesting to hear about that again. For our last question for you, we wanted to ask, how can conservatives and liberals find a common ground on which environmental policies to implement?
Um, so one of the interesting things to me has been studying fuel economy standards, which were a compromise of some sort way back in the 70s when they were implemented. There are certain things to do with energy and self-sufficiency that I think are natural places to look for some common ground, which is um, rapidly getting undone by the incredible productivity of natural gas and oil in the US now. So a few years ago, it seemed like that was sort of the common ground, and maybe there's still something there because there's a lot of potential in the US to grow biofuels and produce things that are not quite as carbon intensive as oil potentially. But something about not importing oil from the Middle East might be a place to look. Although, of course, as we do less of that, that doesn't work anymore. What else? I think that air pollution co-benefits is another place to look for some common ground. So I think that historically, for whatever reason, I've found that conservatives are a little more receptive to the notion that smog is no good and that we want to be able to see when we look out our window and so on, right? And so uh, the if you sort of monetized benefits from getting rid of a gasoline engine or getting rid of a coal-fired power plant, the monetized benefits tend to be perhaps even higher for the local air pollution than they are for climate change. And so to kind of emphasize that a bit more, that's of course what EPA did with the Clean Power Plan at the end of the Obama administration, is they really kind of tried to play up the cost benefit on the local air pollution benefits, and kind of pointed out that it's worth shutting these coal plants even if you don't care at all about climate, right? That the cost benefit analysis passes just based on the health impacts and just sort of smog and visibility impacts from air pollution. Of course, it didn't work, but it was the attempt they made, and I guess I still think that that's at least a place to kind of look for some common ground. Yeah, what else would I say on that? I guess the other one might be in the electric grid, to kind of try and think about what changes to the electric grid um, do things that improve environmental quality and improve things like reliability of the grid, stability of the grid at the same time, right? So sort of point out the failure in the Texas grid recently when it got cold, and kind of to the extent it's possible to argue for reforming electric grids in a way that's kind of compatible with different goals, providing reliability and stability for business operations and people, and also trying to green it and modernize it at the same time um, might be a place to look. And then got to be something about trade, which and globalization that we haven't touched on much, really, any of us. But there's something about sort of imports carbon intense import, trying to replace carbon intense imports with slightly less carbon intense things that are domestically produced might be a place to look for some common ground as well.
Great, thank you so much. I will echo what Amy said again. I know these questions are very broad, and climate change questions are always ever going, ongoing. So appreciate the insight regardless of how complex they can be. So we'll move on to our closing questions to kind of tie in, bring back in the unification theme that we've sort of been going off of. There are 3 questions here. You can choose to answer all of them, or maybe 1 or 2, whatever you would like to speak on. So what are some ways that we can root for sustainability in a way that aligns with conservative values? Where did our liberal solutions fall short? And what are ways that we can get involved in these solutions? So I will open the floor. Whoever wants to start can do so.
Well, I'll jump in quick. And to be very crisp about it, at least in the United States, the political right is not particularly animated by, quote, conservative values, unquote. The political right is a reactionary force that is driven by considerations that have absolutely zero to do with anything that a political scientist would call classically, Burkean or Oskatian conservatism. So when liberals try to say things like I said earlier, what is conservative about playing dice with the planet? It does not really make an impact because most of the people on the right don't even think that way anymore. So conservative values are the wrong way to lens this conversation. Where do liberal solutions fall short? I'm not entirely sure the problem is with liberal solutions unless we get into the world of eco-socialism that we were hearing about earlier, because obviously that's going to fall short with the political right. But even market-oriented responses fall short with the political right. So for instance, the advocates of carbon pricing are standing on the shoulders of people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, some of the most important libertarian economists of their day, who argued that if you have a pollution problem, rather than trying to regulate every nook and cranny of the economy to address it, just put a price on the pollution, get the market signals correct, and then allow capitalism in the form of consumers and producers to adjust in their pursuit of economic well-being and profit. That's all you need to do. So has carbon pricing made a dent with the political right? Not really, even though it's been endorsed now recently by the American Petroleum Institute of all places, the Business Roundtable, the US Chamber of Commerce, ExxonMobil, and it doesn't matter at all. And the main reason is that the problem is not the architecture of the legislative solution. The problem is the firm belief on the right that conceding anything on climate change is to concede to AOC the power to remake the United States economy. So how do we get involved in maybe bettering that project? Well, there are people on the right, who do believe in climate action, but they're a small minority, and those who and for many of them, it's just a secondary or tertiary concern. I mean, there's endless surveys out there that you may have seen from the Yale Climate Communications Project and others to find that even the Republican Party, it's not quite as grim as you might think as far as their opinions about climate change and the case for decarbonization. Heck, if I were out there trying to prove a point, I could cherry pick some studies to find that there's majority support in the Republican Party for carbon pricing, for regulation at EPA to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. But for Republicans who feel that way, they don't feel strong enough on those issues to prioritize them relative to how they feel about changing the name of Mr. Potato Head or Dr. Seuss books or whatever the outrage of the cancel culture stories on social media might be. And that's a real problem. I mean, the bottom line is until Republicans start losing elections because they're climate denialists or that they're against climate action, they're not going to move. They believe that in the last electoral cycle, their attacks on the Green New Deal were a help and not a hindrance. And thus their positions on climate change were a net positive, not a net negative. And until that calculation changes, they're going to do very well. Now, how do you change that calculation? calculation. Well, as much as I have no problem with people who spend their time marching with Greta Thunberg in Manhattan or whatnot, that has no impact on Republicans. I mean, why, if you're Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, what do you care how many people showed up in a blue city who otherwise would vote against you on 50 other different issues, marched against your party, your position on climate change? What you need to do is change the calculus and the balance of opinion in the Republican Party. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's hard work. It is not going to happen overnight, but it's the only way through the needle.
I would also add that, I mean, I feel like a bit of a broken record here, but this business of acting at a local level, I do think can be incredibly powerful. So we had a Republican mayor, Kevin Faulconer, who was presented with a climate action plan for San Diego. And when it was first presented to him, he just laughed and, sent Nicole Capretz out of the room with a flea in her ear, as we say in the UK. I can't imagine why we say that, but just sent her away. And then she went to every committee and, every board and every kind of lower level of the city government and talked to them about the issues on a local level. And again, as Mark said, conservatives care about clean air. Somehow that, they care about smog and clean air and these kind of quality of life issues, even if they don't believe in climate change or they're ideologically opposed to it. And so, she did the groundwork, got all this buy-in, and the next time she went to Faulconer, he took it on, and now it's one of his proudest legacies. And so I think there's a kind of high touch sort of local action and kind of political work that one can do that appeals to things that really are universal about the places that you live, about, fresh air and clean water and, shade trees and these sorts of things. And that this is really where so much of this stuff will actually get done at this sort of municipal level. And so I think that you absolutely can align with conservative values that are universal values, and their values about where you want to raise your children, and what kind of environment you want to raise your kids. And it's much harder at higher levels because then you get into this ideological sort of morass in which the science stops mattering and, the local issues don't bite and so on. But yeah, that would be one way to think about it. And so an answer also to how do you get involved, like maybe at that level, institutional and municipal and these sorts of levels. Electoral politics are pretty disappointing when it comes to the environment. The poor woman, Annalena, what's her name, Boerback or something, who's just taken over the Green Party in Germany and looks like she might be the next German chancellor. I mean, she is getting the most unbelievable campaign against her because she's threatening the pipeline from Russia. So the Kremlin are kind of on her case. I mean, I think, the kind of high profile sort of national level is just such a difficult arena. But take it down a notch, take it down a level, and it's much more human.
I think I don't know that I'm going to have a direct answer, but I think the interaction between industry and all of this is a super interesting place to look. So when the Trump administration was rolling back the fuel economy standards a couple of years ago, Ford and GM and basically the whole American auto industry came out and said, no, don't do that. Like we were fine with those, and we those of us studying this have our theories, but it looks like one of the things that had happened was the Obama era CAFE standards were tilted very heavily against the Japanese and Korean importers because of the way they did some things with crediting. And so, those standards were pretty good for US manufacturers. They didn't want them to go away. They were pretty good for their profits. And the same thing, if you look at refining of gasoline, particularly in California right now, there's sort of this mystery windfall profit for a lot of the refineries in California. And a lot of that is actually potentially due to environmental regulation, potentially due to the cap and trade system, where they get a bunch of permits allocated to them for free, and then they just pass the cost of that through into the price of gasoline at the pump and collect all the value of those permits up, right? So there's ways to do pricing that end up handing a lot of money to industry. Whereas if instead of any sort of price policy, if what we were doing was just suppressing gasoline demand in California with an electric car policy or something, which we're also doing, but if that were the only thing we were doing, then all of a sudden the refineries are in bad shape, right? Because now there's surpluses of gasoline. They can't be having as much of a markup. They don't get these permits for free that they can then charge consumers for, in some sense, right? So thinking about the intricacies of kind of what these policies do to industry and why they might be supporting them is an interesting, I think it's an interesting place to look. I promised I didn't have a direct answer to the question, but there's something about kind of the ability to do environmental policy in a way that's maybe protectionist or maybe hands some money to industry that maybe the left doesn't really like, but that maybe is a way to get a compromise that is potentially a place to look. You don't want to tell the left that too much, because if they understand that too deeply, then they're going to oppose. I mean, it's a tricky business, right, in terms of how these things work. But yeah.
Can I just ask about that, Mark? How does that help the problem of?
Well, I promised I wasn't. So how does it help the problem of bringing people together?
No. How does it help the problem of greenhouse gas emissions?
Oh.
You are, basically doing giveaways to the fossil fuel industry.
Well, think of it as, right, it raises the price of gasoline by pretty much. More expensive gasoline is automatically good for refineries, as long as they're not actually paying a carbon tax, which we don't have in California, as long as it's some sort of a tradable credit, something that they, right? So that's good for them. Even though higher price gasoline means people will buy a bit less of it, that's still okay for the refineries as long as they're collecting most of the extra cost, right? And so it kind of accomplishes, I don't know, economists are I'm pretty again, I'm not really happy with that, but it does get that industry on board, because they're profiting off it, and it is doing something for climate, because when gas is as expensive as it is, people don't buy as much of it, right? And so there is sort of it's an expensive way to get some climate improvement, because it transfers a lot of money to the holders of the permits, like the refineries. But it's, the electric utility industry is in a totally different boat, right? Because they would pass those costs through to us too, but they're not allowed to, because they're regulated with sort of rate of return, right? So but the refineries are not. They can charge whatever they want for gasoline, and so they're happy to pass sort of the full price of the permit through and then put it in their pockets. So it's yeah. Does that answer your question? I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I mean, my question was just, okay, so it's a price signal, and so people will buy less gas. Yeah. I worry it's not. It's too little.
Yeah,
too little, too late. But
you can make it even bigger, right? You can imagine making that price signal even bigger. But then the question is,
I mean, take Sweden. It's absolutely astronomical.
The difference between the cost of making the gas and what somebody pays at the pump, we call that the wedge, right? The question is where that price wedge goes.
Yeah.
If you're a carbon tax, that price wedge goes to the government, which is not good for the refineries or anyone. But under the current system, most of it goes to the oil industry. That wedge goes to the oil industry instead of the government, and so that's the sense in which it can be good for them. And also,
I do feel my old leftist soul rebelling at the thought of this. But anyway, and I had a question for Jerry actually about, you mentioned that, there's no one better than, fund managers like BlackRock and places at understanding climate change, that they are the ones, this is one response to climate deniers on the left is, hey, look at your natural allies in, the financial sector or whatever. And indeed, one of the best reports I ever read about climate change was put out by JP Morgan Chase. But they continue to invest in the industry, even though they write a report that really is one of the absolutely most nihilistic most sort of pessimistic things about the possibility of civilizational collapse. And so I was just wondering why that extraordinary sophistication in terms of analysis and information on the part of the capitalists doesn't translate more directly into a kind of massive divestment from this sector.
Well, I think the answer is that corporate actors, particularly those in the investment community, which are commanding billions and trillions of dollars of capital flow, they're not concerned about climate change out of altruism. They're concerned because they know what it's going to mean ultimately to their investments and their bottom line. And so they have a collective interest in encouraging governmental response. But if government is not going to respond, and let's face it, government has not responded in any really meaningful fashion anywhere towards climate change. The aggregate impact of the mitigation policies adopted in Europe are relatively trivial relative to the scale of the problem. And the same goes for the United States. Even the states that have done a lot, like California, are doing a lot in a very low carbon economy, which is not really where the game is being played. So if global actors, if governments aren't going to act, then asking capitalists to forego profit opportunities because of their altruistic feelings about the future of mankind, I think is asking more than the lift than the system can really bear. I think it is remarkable enough that there have been so many corporate actors and investors with foresight, not just Citi and BlackRock and JP Morgan, just about all of them have signed on in one case or another with very strong arguments for decarbonization by 2050. That in itself is a remarkable thing. And I don't think that this is primarily greenwashing. Not out of this community, it's not, because it is affecting some of their decisions at the margin. So it seems as if they are quite genuinely held. But ultimately, we should not put our hopes in corporate actors foregoing profit opportunities to save us. We need governments to act. And that's the ultimate game.
And that's their point, is you need to act so that we can then do our business in a way that doesn't imperil everything a couple of generations down the line.
Mm-hmm.
That's very helpful, thank you.
All right, if nobody has any other comments to make on that, I do have to say I'm very excited to have this video be recorded and for me to be able to show it to my friends and family. This has been a great discussion so far. We just have one quick last concluding question for all of you, which is, what would you say to someone now who aligns with the Republican Party but is looking for ways to support the climate movement, in terms of voting or, who to look for as a kind of figure? If any of you could speak on that, please go ahead.
Well, there are a number of Republican groups that are climate friendly, or if not Republican groups, then Republican friendly groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a grassroots organization that promotes carbon taxes with dividends to return the revenues back to the American public. There is Republican, led by my friend Bob Inglis, former Republican congressman from South Carolina, who lost his seat in the 2010 Tea Party surge, in part because of his support for climate action and the carbon tax. There is the American Conservative Coalition led by Benji Backer, which is a very Republican organization of young conservatives who believe that climate change is real and demands more attention than the GOP has given it, though they're not anywhere near as ambitious as I would be if I were drafting their policy agenda. But there are organizations like that. There's the Evangelical Environmental Network, run by Mitch Hescox, another friend of mine, who's trying to make the case to the evangelical community that there is nothing in the Bible that gives a green light to the absolute destruction of God's creation. And there are other organizations. If I haven't mentioned them, I don't mean to demean, disparage, or ignore them. But the problem is that as long as the media ecosystem on the right is churning out Rush Limbaugh style climate denialism 24/7, the impact of these organizations is simply not going to be anywhere near enough to roll back the tide, no matter how well they're funded or how many members they have. And that's because, again, as Winston Churchill put it, there is no such thing as public opinion, there's only published opinion. And the power of Republican elites and their media system to impact how the GOP feels and how the party votes. Because let's face it, right now, there really is no GOP establishment outside of Fox News. They are the GOP establishment. They control the party. They and Breitbart and Daily Caller and the thick network of talk radio and Russian disinformation. They're the ones that run the party. And so while I would say to someone who is Republican leaning or a Republican member that if they have a reasonable mainstream position on climate change, there are organizations you can join that at the margin will at least allow your position to count. And the more people that were to join those organizations and involve themselves in activism, the better. But another part of me says that all that is well and good, but that and a quarter will buy you a cup of coffee, because ultimately, as long as the Republican Party is winning elections, no matter how well you do at the margin, Kevin McCarthy is going to be the leader of the House if the Republicans take the House. Mitch McConnell is going to be the leader in the Senate, no matter how many Mitt Romneys you have out there, or Lisa Murkowski's, or Susan Collins, who cares about climate change. Doesn't really matter. The Republican leadership is adamantly opposed to climate action. And if the Republicans regain the White House in the near future, it'll probably be Donald Trump again. So it really doesn't matter at the margin whether these organizations are robust or not, because the best they can do is elect some reasonably minded Republicans who will then throw their leadership votes to people who believe they were put on this earth to bury climate action under the guise of striking out against AOC's Green New Deal. So what I would argue is that the only way the Republican Party is going to become more reasonable on climate change ultimately is if they take a series of consecutive electoral losses that are reasonably clean and consequential, which would require them to rethink their investments in the policy arenas where they've gone. One of the places they're losing support is in suburban America. So if the GOP starts losing elections again and again and again, and they lose them decisively, then they may be willing to reconsider all of what I call the mosaic of crazy that has driven away educated suburban voters. But if they're not losing elections, they're not going to reconsider. So maybe you should become a Democrat, Mr. Republican.
And then if anyone else wants to join in any way or have any comments as well.
I think that was an excellent concluding thought.
Yeah, nothing to add to that. It was perfect.
All right. Well, then on that ending note, my coworkers and I we just want to say thank you so much for our speakers giving us this time of the day to come and talk to us and have this discussion. We highly appreciate and value all of what you have said and have had to share with us, and for helping us grapple with these kind of social issues. Very enlightening discussion we've had here. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined and is watching or watching from home. We hope you all enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Appreciate having you here. That was great.